He could walk into any dealership in America today and drive out in something brand new, paid in full, no loan, no haggling. He has the money. He's had it for years. And yet on Saturday morning before the sun is fully up, the car that pulls out of his driveway is the same one that's been sitting in his garage since most of his neighbors were still renting apartments. People who don't know him assume he can't afford better. The ones who do know him just stopped asking why a long time ago because the answer never satisfied them anyway. He'd say something about the engine, or the way the door sounds when it shuts, and they'd nod and change the subject. But there's a reason he never gives the real answer, and it's not because he's hiding something. It's because the real answer takes longer than a driveway conversation, and most people don't actually want to hear it. He's 61 now, born in 1965, which means he was a teenager during the exact years when half the cars he loves were already considered old news, and a kid during the years when nobody thought twice about leaving a 9-year-old home alone with a key around his neck and a number to call if the house caught fire. He grew up the kind of quiet that isn't shyness, it's just what happens to a person who spends a few thousand afternoons solving his own problems before anyone else even noticed there was a problem. He reads constantly. He fixes things other people throw away, and in his garage right now sit 2 cars that by any reasonable financial logic, he should have replaced decades ago. So here's where it actually starts, because most people get the timeline backwards. They assume a man falls in love with a car first, and the personality comes later, shaped by the hobby. It's closer to the opposite. The personality was already there, quietly forming through an entire childhood, long before he ever turned a key in an ignition. The car didn't make him this way. The car just happened to be the first thing in his life built exactly for a person like him. Every Saturday, somewhere around 6 in the morning, his garage door goes up, and for the next few hours, nothing in the rest of the world exists. Coffee on the workbench, radio low. Hands moving over something that isn't broken exactly, just imperfect in a way only he can feel. Most people in his life have never seen this version of him. His wife knows he's out in the garage. His co-workers, if he still has any from the office days, never saw this side at all. There's a reason he protects those hours so carefully, and it's not really about the car. It's about what those hours let him be, away from everyone, for a little while. But he's not actually as alone in this as it looks from the outside. Drive past almost any parking lot in any mid-sized American city early on a Saturday, and you'll find a small, slightly strange gathering. No entry fee, no judges, no agenda. Just men standing around old hoods drinking gas station coffee before 8 in the morning, some of them strangers to each other 20 minutes earlier. It started as one parking lot in Southern California in the early 2000s and quietly spread into hundreds of versions of itself across the country, completely without coordination, almost like the format was simply waiting for someone to discover it. And once you notice that pattern, you start asking a different question. Not why does he love this car, but why does an entire generation of men keep finding their way to the exact same kind of morning? To understand the garage hours, you have to go back further than the car itself, back to a version of him that nobody in that parking lot ever met. Around 40% of people his age grew up the same way he did, with both parents working or one parent gone and a key that meant something completely different than it means to a kid today. By the late 80s, something like 10 million American kids were coming home to an empty house for part of the day, which sounds bleak written down like that. But the actual psychology turned out to be more interesting than the tragedy version everyone assumes. Kids who grew up that way didn't necessarily end up worse off emotionally. What they ended up with instead was an unusual tolerance for solitude and a habit of solving things quietly without raising their hand and waiting for permission, because there usually wasn't anyone there to ask. And then, almost on schedule, that habit got handed its first real outlet. In 1983, when he would have been right around the age, nearly half of all 16-year-olds in this country already had a license. Today, that number's closer to a quarter. A teenager back then getting a car wasn't a milestone parents debated for months. It was closer to the default setting of growing up, and the car itself was rarely a gift chosen with him in mind. It was something inherited, beat up, handed down, an engine he had to learn to keep alive himself because nobody else was going to do it for him. So by the time he was old enough to actually choose a car as an adult, the wiring was already there. Freedom meant something you had to maintain yourself. Trust meant being handed the keys with no instruction manual and figuring it out. That's the part that explains the garage, but it doesn't explain the parking lot. For that, you have to look at something that has almost nothing to do with cars at all, and almost everything to do with what's quietly disappeared from men's lives over the last 30 years. Back in 1990, more than half of American men said they had at least 6 close friends. By the early 2020s, that number had fallen to roughly a quarter. Meanwhile, the share of men with no close friends at all jumped fivefold over the same stretch. Women's numbers dropped too, but nowhere near as steeply, which tells you this isn't just modern life getting busier. It's something specific happening to men. Bowling leagues closed, union halls emptied out. The corner bar where your father knew the bartender by name mostly became a parking lot for something else. Researchers call these places third places, somewhere that isn't home and isn't work, where you can show up without an invitation and belong anyway. And almost all of them quietly vanished while nobody was really watching. The old car world never got the memo. Walk into the largest antique car club in the country, and you'll find something almost nobody mentions out loud, which is that you don't even need to own a classic car to join. They built the entire club around belonging, not ownership, decades before anyone was talking about a loneliness crisis. The biggest single model club for one specific muscle car has more followers online than most professional sports franchises. And the informal layer underneath all of it, the parking lot coffee mornings with no name on the door, exists for one reason only, which is that a group of men needed somewhere to stand next to each other regularly without having to explain why. There's something specific about working on an engine with another man that face-to-face conversation can't replicate, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Sitting across a table, making eye contact, naming a feeling out loud, that's the format most advice about friendship defaults to. And it's also the format men consistently find hardest to start. Standing shoulder to shoulder over a carburetor is the opposite. Two men facing the same problem instead of each other, hands busy, eyes on the engine, long stretches of silence that don't feel awkward because there's always something to point at instead of someone to look at. The hard conversations about work, about a marriage, about a father who's gotten older, tend to surface in exactly that kind of setting, almost by accident, in a way they rarely do when the only thing on the table is, let's talk. Nobody built the garage to be therapy. It just turned out to work like one, for a generation that was never handed the words for the other kind. Now here's where the story usually gets told wrong, because most people assume the attachment is really about one specific car, the kind you'd see on a poster. It isn't, not exactly. It's about a much smaller, much stranger thing, and it shows up the moment you ask him what he'd actually feel if he sold either of his 2 cars tomorrow for triple what he paid. He wouldn't say money. He'd go quiet for a second, and what he's actually picturing, even if he never says it out loud, is everything that car happened to be parked outside of. The hospital visit. The argument in the driveway he'd rather forget. Driving nowhere in particular just to get 15 minutes of quiet on a bad week. None of that shows up on a title transfer. A car that's been around for 30 or 40 years stops being an object somewhere along the way and starts functioning more like a witness, the kind that never talks but somehow remembers everything anyway. Selling it doesn't feel like losing a machine. It feels uncomfortably close to losing the years that happened inside it, which is a strange thing to admit you're attached to, so most men just don't admit it. They talk about the engine instead. That's also roughly the moment in the conversation where he'll mention which cars he actually means because there's a specific, fairly narrow list most men his age gravitate toward, and it isn't random. Ask which old American car he'd save first, and you'll usually land on one of about 5, give or take an argument that can fill an entire afternoon on its own. A Mustang from the late 60s, because it's the one car that's been in continuous production since the World's Fair it debuted at, which means it's the rare classic a man can still walk into a dealership today and buy a brand new descendant of. A Camaro from the same era, built deliberately as an answer to that Mustang, with one GM executive reportedly telling reporters at launch that the name meant something like a small, vicious animal built to hunt them. A GTO because the whole muscle car era technically started with an engineer quietly breaking his own company's safety rule to drop a bigger engine into a mid-size body and calling it an option package instead of a new model, just to get it past the people who would have said no. A Corvette because it's the one American sports car that never stopped being built, not for one single year, through every recession and gas shortage that killed almost everything else on this list. And somewhere in 5th place, depending entirely on which side of an old, friendly, slightly tribal argument you're standing on, either a Bronco or a Charger, The kind of disagreement that's been going on so long in garages like his that nobody actually expects to settle it. And honestly, nobody wants to. What's easy to miss is how much of that attachment was built for him before he ever touched a wrench, just by growing up in front of a television that couldn't stop showing those same 5 silhouettes for 50 straight years. The shape became inseparable from the feeling of being a kid who wanted one, long before he had the money or the garage to actually own it. But the love for these specific cars isn't only nostalgia for a shape on a screen. There's a harder, more practical reason underneath it, and it has almost nothing to do with sentiment. A 2025 national survey found that 98% of car owners think they should be able to choose who repairs their own vehicle, and a roughly equal majority across both political parties supports the right to fix it themselves. That kind of agreement almost never happens in this country anymore, which should tell you something about how deep the frustration actually runs. A former General Motors engineer, speaking on the record, described the modern industry's shift in blunt terms. Vehicles built around roughly 100,000 miles of useful life instead of the 250,000 miles an older car could comfortably reach with hand tools and a Sunday afternoon. Independent repair shops report being locked out of basic diagnostic data on a near-daily basis, forced to send cars they're fully capable of fixing straight to a dealership instead, simply because the manufacturer never intended for anyone outside its own network to look under the hood. For a man who spent his childhood solving his own problems because there wasn't always someone around to ask, that isn't an abstract policy complaint. It's the same exact insult from a different direction, an institution telling him, again, that he isn't trusted to handle something that's technically his. The old car never does this to him. Every control does exactly one thing, and you can feel immediately whether it worked or not. A choke either chokes or it doesn't. There's no firmware update, no menu tree, no software waiting to be revoked remotely. J.D. Power's own research found infotainment systems are now the single most problem-ridden category in the entire new car industry. More than the engine, more than the brakes. And one safety lab found that fumbling through a modern touchscreen slows a driver's reaction time about as much as driving under the influence. Europe's own safety regulators have started requiring physical buttons back into new cars starting in 2026, which means the thing he's been saying in his garage for 20 years just became, officially, a matter of measurable highway safety rather than an old man's preference. There's a number that explains why he never quite trusts the phrase, "they don't make them like they used to," because in his case, it's not nostalgia talking, it's the actual math. The average car on American roads now sits at a record 12.8 years old, the 8th straight year that numbers climbed, and a basic repair shop visit averages close to $900 before anything serious gets fixed. Cars are lasting longer, sure, but mostly because people can't afford to replace them as casually as they used to. Not because anything got simpler under the hood. His two cars are the inverse of that whole equation. Less safe by today's crash standards, sure. Less efficient, sure, but completely legible from front bumper to back and capable of running another 50 years if someone competent keeps doing exactly what he's already doing every Saturday morning. He brings up one story more than any other when this conversation comes up, and it's not really about a car at all. It's about a hammer. Back in 1968, the Pontiac general manager went on television and personally took a sledgehammer to his own car's new rubber bumper just to prove on camera that it wouldn't dent. The bumper held. The era around it didn't. 6 years later, that same model was gone, killed off by insurance surcharges, new emissions rules, and an oil embargo that arrived almost overnight. He finds something almost funny in how familiar that triad sounds now. Regulation, cost, and sudden energy anxiety, reshaping an entire industry around him for the second time in his life, decades apart. Like history forgot it already ran this experiment once. And then there's the other story, the one that actually makes him angry instead of amused, about a federal program back in 2009 that paid people to trade in old cars on the condition that every single engine get destroyed on the spot with a chemical solution before the car could even be crushed. Almost 700,000 vehicles gone on purpose, some of them the exact same cars men like him would pay real money for today. He doesn't bring that one up to win an argument. He brings it up because it's the cleanest example he's ever found of the thing he's spent his whole life quietly pushing back against, a system that decided on his behalf when something stopped being worth keeping. And underneath all of that sits one more thing, quieter than the rest, that he probably wouldn't bring up unless you asked directly. Most of the cars on that short list everyone argues about happen to be American, and that's not really an accident either, though the truth there is more complicated than it looks from the outside. Jeep has been ranked the most patriotic brand in the country for over 2 decades running, and Ford sits right behind it, ahead of companies that spend a fortune trying to manufacture exactly that feeling and still can't buy their way to it. But if you actually trace where today's most American cars are built, by the strict letter of where the parts come from, the list gets uncomfortable fast, with several Tesla models and a handful of Honda's American-built lineup outranking most of what Detroit currently sells. He's not blind to that contradiction, and most men in his position aren't either because they grew up watching the real version of it happen in real time. He was a kid during the oil shocks that nearly killed Detroit outright, a teenager while Japanese imports quietly outbuilt and outsold the cars his own father trusted, and an adult by the time the comeback finally started showing up in showrooms again. He didn't inherit the patriotism around these cars secondhand. He watched the whole arc happen, the confidence, the collapse, and the slow climb back, on the same timeline as his own life falling apart and rebuilding itself a few times over. Which brings the whole thing back around to the question nobody in his driveway ever actually gets a straight answer to. He could buy whatever he wanted tomorrow morning. A new car wouldn't need rebuilding, wouldn't leave him stranded on a shoulder somewhere nursing a fuel line in 90-degree heat, wouldn't ask anything of him at all beyond a monthly payment and a charging cable. And that, it turns out, is closer to the actual problem than the solution. Somewhere in his 50s, without ever announcing it to anyone, he stopped chasing excitement and started chasing something closer to peace. And a brand new car, for all its comfort, is built entirely around stimulation. New systems to learn, new screens to navigate, new anxiety about the first scratch. The old car asks for nothing he hasn't already figured out a long time ago. No learning curve, no performance, just the exact same sound the doors always made at the exact speed where the wheel always starts to shudder a little, and somehow he loves it more for staying that predictable. There's a version of this story where that makes him sound like he's settled, like simplicity is just another word for giving up on anything new. It isn't. And the people who assume that usually haven't noticed what it actually costs a person to stop caring what strangers think of his driveway. Choosing the same old thing in a culture built entirely around convincing you the old thing is already outdated takes a kind of confidence most people never have to test because most people never stop needing the new thing to prove something about themselves in the first place. He stopped needing that a while ago. Not because he lost interest in being seen, but because somewhere around that garage, that Saturday parking lot, that one car nobody's allowed to ask him to sell, he found a few hours a week where being seen was never really the point at all. I'll admit something here because it's the one part of this that surprised me while putting it together. I expected the patriotism angle to be the simple part, the easy flag-waving beat at the end. It turned out to be the most honest one because the men who actually love these cars know exactly how complicated American-made has gotten. And somehow that knowledge doesn't shrink the feeling at all. It just makes it a little more earned. So maybe that's the real shape of it. Not a man clinging to something old because he's afraid of something new. A man who spent his entire childhood being handed responsibility before anyone checked if he was ready for it, who built an entire identity out of fixing things quietly and asking nothing of anyone, and who eventually found, almost by accident, one of the last corners of American life where that exact set of habits is still rewarded instead of replaced. The garage door, the Saturday morning lot, the engine that needs exactly the kind of patience he's had since he was 9 years old home alone after school. None of it ever needed an upgrade. It was built right the first time, and he spent the rest of his life proving he can still keep it that way. So here's the question worth sitting with after this one ends. Somewhere in your own life, is there something you've kept around far longer than it made financial sense to? Not because you couldn't replace it, but because some part of you quietly refused to.